and naturally also on board of this bus. And I would like to introduce the two of us up here. Since you're going to have to spend the whole day with us, you might as well get to know us. And it's particularly important that you get to know the young man next to me, because you have to trust him, and so therefore you should know him. And he is a very important person, our driver, the man who moves the bus, in other words. Without him, I could show you a nice movie about Berlin, tell you all kinds of stuff, but we wouldn't be moving around a lot. He is going to be taking us through the city and, of course, back to the station at the end of the day, and his name is Andy. So, say hello to Andy. I'll try to be nice to him for you so that he does what we want him to do. And my name is Miriam, and I obviously will be your guide. I'll be responsible for giving you all the important information about Berlin. It's a pretty tough job, as you can imagine, but an even tougher one is for you to actually take in all the information that I'll be giving you. You're going to have complete overloads after a certain amount of time, and that's when we strategically place our stops along the way, so you don't blow out a fuse or something like that. And we will have quite a few stops along the way. To a certain extent, naturally, I also will be responsible collective identity already on the train. You are now members of bus number 6, by the way. No matter which way you stick your sticker, it's still bus number 6. And from now on till the very end of the day, that's all you are. You're not members of a cruise, you're not members of a group of people that you might know on the other buses, but rather only members of bus number 6. And at the end, then, if we keep that in mind, everything will work out. And I'm sure you understand that timing is important here, but fortunately you're in Prussia now. We're pretty good about timing and organization here. And timing is important, since we have to get you back to the train station on time, because you want to make that ship in Warnemünde. And a cab back up to Warnemünde costs about $300, by the way, so we don't want to deal with that. And the trains only have a certain slot on the tracks, because of course we've got lots of train traffic going through there, so even though it's your train, it can only wait for a very limited amount of time. And so of course I need your help when it comes to timing. The two of us up here know what you want to see, how much time we need for that, and how much time we need to get you back to the train station. So as I said, timing is important. Now, I do understand that you've been traveling through some time zones, so I want to give you a fair chance in sticking to the times that I give you. Let's see. Yeah, it's 10 minutes to 11 on my watch, so that seems to be the right time. 10 to 11, that's Miriam time from now on. That's the time we'll be working with today. And the most important time today is the time that they're expecting us back at the train station, is at 5:45. So that you basically have an understanding of what kind of a slot we're working with. It's at my discretion whether we're a few minutes earlier or later, but that's about the time we're roughly working with. Another time that might be interesting for your stomachs, by the way, is that we're scheduled for lunch. A little late for American standards, but still bearable, I would think. We're scheduled for lunch at 1 o'clock, and I think we'll be able to manage that. We've got a lot of roadblocks along the way today, lots of festivities going on, demonstrations and such, but it's Saturday, so the traffic shouldn't be all that bad. Now, aside from those two important times, obviously, the timing, especially during the breaks, is important because, as I said, 5 minutes graphically and historically, and yet it was a part of East Berlin when Berlin was divided. And there you can already see how confusion can set in pretty quickly. Borders don't tend to be straight lines, and they certainly weren't in Berlin. And one other aspect of Berlin, which has nothing to do with the Cold War history that we have here, but with the development years. 900. Where did I get that figure? 800. That's quite enough, but still a lot. And I think you'll learn to understand that also as we travel through the city. And I find that important to understand today, because today, now that Berlin is finally reunified and once again the seat of the government, and therefore to a certain extent also an economical center, or turning into one for Germany today, Berlin, being such a young city, is not burdened with medieval structures, you see, and therefore predestined to become a city of the 21st century. And I think you'll find that also along the way as we continue. And to give you a better understanding of how little of Berlin is actually old as a part of Berlin, directly in front of us we now have two tower-like structures. And these tower-like structures indicate where the Frankfurt Gate used to be. And if you look here to your left, we've got an entrance to the subway, the U underground, basically. And it says Frankfurter Tor. Frankfurt, you can probably figure out, means Frankfurt. And Tor means gate, T-O-R. Just like the Brandenburg Gate is Brandenburger Tor. So anybody, you don't have to study the history, you don't have to look at old maps, anybody can figure out, if you speak German, that this is where a city gate had once stood. Just like any European city of certain size and importance, Berlin was fortified. This was the last fortification of Berlin that stood until 1861. And if you look at the development of a city, that's not an incredibly long time ago. 1861, 140 years ago, we still had a city gate there, and everything beyond it, in other words, behind us, was not Berlin yet. And there's still a lot of Berlin behind us, by the way. So this, by the way, the Frankfurt Gate was the easternmost city gate of Berlin, and the Brandenburg Gate was the westernmost city gate. And we're going almost directly to the Brandenburg Gate, so that'll give you a very good understanding of the diameter of the old city. And that, in comparison to how big Berlin is today, is really quite remarkable. The Frankfurt Gate, by the way, was named after the fact that that is where the road to Frankfurt began. And of course, this isn't the better known Frankfurt with the banks and the big airport. Since it's behind us, it's east of us, and Frankfurt on River Main is, as you might know, in the southwest of Berlin, of Germany, sorry. But rather, this is an indication of a smaller Frankfurt on the river Oder, which is 60 kilometers east of Berlin at the border to Poland. And that, by the way, explains why Frankfurt has such a complicated name. Why do we mention the river it lies along? Because there's another one. Have to make a difference between the two. Plus, when we passed the Frankfurt Gate just a moment ago, we've also entered Karl Marx Avenue. That's the name of the street here. Some people wonder, have we not gotten around to changing the name yet? Have we not realized that times have changed and that this is not a communist city anymore? Well, let's put it this way. Germany has learned the very hard way that it's that it's absolutely impossible to ignore your history, or that is, in other terms, if you do, it's not going to work out in the end. Nobody can ignore their history. That's a part of what brought you to where you are, whether you like it or not. And Karl Marx was German. Okay, he was a communist, but nonetheless he's a part of our history, and the communist history is a part of our history. We might as well acknowledge it, whether we like it or not. They did change a lot of names of streets, of course. They did draw the line at those who actually committed crimes against humanity, those who really didn't have a lot of connection to our history, but Karl Marx, amongst, let's say, the list of communists in world history, is one of the lesser evils, and so his name has remained. We would have certainly drawn the line at Stalin if East Germany hadn't done it on its own. The street used to be called Stalinallee, you see, Stalin Avenue, because Stalin decided after World War II that this would be his parade street. And so he imported an architectural style that we can by no means consider typical for East Berlin or East Germany. The buildings that you've been seeing since the Frankfurt Gate, these cream-colored buildings here, are a style that one would find repeatedly in Russian cities, in former Soviet cities. It was the most common style of rebuilding the Soviet cities after World War II, a style that the Germans have an incredibly charming name for. If you translated the name literally, it sounds a bit stupid, sugar baker's style, but I would interpret that as confectioner's style. And I know in Moscow, the tour guides, at least when they guide in English, they call it wedding cake style. The Berliners are a little bit more brutal. They call it Stalin Baroque. But whatever you want to call the style, it certainly is a style that's, as I said, Stalin brought here, that we only have here on this street, nowhere else, in all of East Germany, even, or former East Germany. And it's kind of ironic, Stalin never survived the completion of this boulevard, and therefore he never turned it into a parade street. And of course, after Stalin's death, eventually, even East Germany figured out that he hadn't been such a nice guy, and so they took all the devotionals down, the big sculpture of Stalin, the street signs, the pictures in every office, and Lenin was PC once again, and in this case Karl Marx. Here to your left, by the way, is a little pedestal with a bust of Karl Marx. I don't know if you're familiar with his features. Most Germans with a certain education would recognize him, whether from the West or from the East. Now, we're still on Karl Marx Avenue, but in a moment we'll be crossing the boundaries between districts. We've got 12 districts officially in Berlin nowadays, and we're now entering the district Mitte. Take a look here to your right, it's a little green sign with yellow letters. Mitte. Mitte means middle, or center. So now we're entering the center of Berlin. And as I said, documented history of almost 800 years. It's kind of hard to imagine when you look around here. It doesn't really look like a city with a medieval history, does it? Don't underestimate the destruction of World War II, first of all. You can pretty much consider that 90% of the inner city of Berlin was destroyed during World War II. So it would be rather futile if I mentioned in every particular building that it had been damaged, because basically you can rest assured they all have. Here in the center, anything that's old, it has been damaged, it was destroyed, it was rebuilt or restored to some extent. And in this case, you have evidence, of course, of what East Germany's politics were in rebuilding the city. For them, everything that was old had been royal and therefore was bad, and everything that was new was theirs and therefore was good. And you can see this theory or this philosophy quite clearly here. We have now reached Alexanderplatz, and Alexanderplatz, or Alexander Square, was first of all one of the very important junctions in the old city, especially in the 20s, when Berlin really, really was a world capital, one of the fastest and most exciting cities of the world at the time. And at that time, this was one of the very important junction points. When this became a part of East Berlin, however, East Germany determined that Alexanderplatz was geographically perfect to be considered the center just of East Berlin. So for them, it was a place of representation. And we still have Asian tourists that come with 15-year-old guidebooks to Berlin, where it says, oh yes, you have to have a photo stop at Alexanderplatz. It's a remarkable place. It really is a rather boring place, to be honest, and not really very aesthetic, but that was a highlight of visiting East Berlin. And the style, the buildings that you see here are, as I said, very representative for the East German style in the 60s and 70s. We have had a competition that dealt with, theoretically restructuring this square. We did determine a winner, and the next step would have been that they would have had to have found financing projects for this. They would have had to have found companies, businesses, industry interested in actually paying for this restructuring. And that's where the whole thing failed. There was no one interested in Alexanderplatz. So many billions had been and are being invested in Berlin elsewhere. And I guess internationally the opinion was that this wasn't the best place to invest billions. So we've had to put the whole thing on hold and have had to accept that the East German architecture would stick around to stay. And who knows, someday maybe it'll be one of the only places where you can still find that style or a reminder of that time. The television tower is, by the way, also a reminder of the East German history. It was built in 1969, and it is the second tallest structure in Europe. The only one taller, naturally, is in Moscow. And the television tower has a height of 368 meters, and it has an observation platform, of course, as well as a restaurant. And just like all these restaurants, our restaurant up there revolves around its own axis. The principle is is always the same. You go up there, you secure yourself a seat. You have to buy something to drink to do that, at least. That's the minimum requirement. So you order an incredibly bad and overpriced cup of coffee, but you bear with it since you want to sit a full rotation. Nobody ever orders anything else because everything is so overpriced, but they do order something so that they can sit down. During East German times, this rotation lasted 1 hour. Now, that doesn't do in a free market system, does it? 1 hour for 1 cup of coffee? No way. Nobody ever left before the full rotation, so now the restaurant revolves twice as fast, because you certainly can drink a cup of coffee in half an hour and nobody stays more than 1 rotation, so they're selling twice as much coffee as before. Then here to your left, the station Alexanderplatz. This is one of the larger junction points in public transportation. The S-Bahn, which is the city train, is public, but also trains going abroad use the same track system. And you'll be seeing that again and again in the course of the day. And then here to your left, quite a few towers. The red one in the background with the flag on top is the Town Hall of Berlin, the red Town Hall for obvious reasons. In other words, the seat of the governing mayor, the Senate, and the Senate of Berlin. The one with the twin steeples there in the background, you'll see that again towards the end of the day, was St. Nicholas Church, which is the oldest church of Berlin, built around the year 1200. And here to your left, St. Mary's Church, the second oldest church of Berlin, built in 1270. And if you know anything about any medieval European city, if you've ever been anywhere in Europe where you found medieval structures, you can imagine what should be found between the two churches, the two oldest churches of Berlin, the narrow streets, the little medieval structures. Of that we have absolutely nothing. What little still existed here before the war was certainly destroyed during the war and torn down after World War II. So the old structures of the centuries past have been completely obliterated. And that, of course, also supports that Berlin is a city of the 19th and 20th century. I'm sure you also know, at least to a certain extent, that Berlin was the seat of a monarchy. And I mean, Central European royal histories are a little bit of a muddle. They've constantly been moving borders around, hierarchies, successional wars were going on, and it wasn't quite as easy as, let's say, the history of the kings and queens of England or something like that. So in order not to go too far, however, nonetheless, we do have to talk about the Hohenzollern dynasty. They were here for the longest. Monarchy was abolished in 1918. So until then, the Hohenzollern dynasty reigned from Berlin. And the palace of the Hohenzollern dynasty was here to the left in front of us, where this incredibly ugly copper-colored building can now be seen. I'll be telling you more about the palace later on. But I want you to at least understand where it was, because, of course, the palace was a center of the city, and a lot of what was built in Berlin was obviously built around the palace, and that includes this large cathedral structure that you can see, the Dome of Berlin, which was built as the Royal Church of Berlin. We will be visiting that, but it won't be until in the afternoon. Just so you know, that's also going to be a part of what you'll be seeing from the inside. It's a Protestant church, by the way. Berlin is predominantly Protestant. Then take a look here to your right, and in the background you can see a golden dome. That is the dome of the new synagogue. This is a Byzantine structure, looks like straight from an Arabic fairy tale, and it used to be one of the largest and most beautiful synagogues in Europe, not just in Germany or just in Berlin. It was one of 20 synagogues in Berlin, and it was the only synagogue, ironically, that was not destroyed by the Nazis during the Kristallnacht, but instead completely destroyed by the bombs of World War II. And it was rebuilt and reopened as a museum rather than a temple, since we have a community, a Jewish community today of at best 15,000 versus the more than 160,000 that lived in Berlin prior to 1933. There is no way we would need such a large temple, and therefore it serves a better purpose as a museum than as a temple. We do have active temples if you're curious, but certainly not such big ones. Then here to your right, this little green square is the pleasure garden. This used to be the garden of the Palace of Berlin, and at the end of the pleasure garden you can see 2 of the 5 museums on the Museums Island. The Old National Gallery in the background and the Old Museum. The Old Museum is the oldest museum of Berlin. It was inaugurated in 1830, and that means it's also one of the oldest museums of Germany. Inside the Old Museum we have the Hellenistic and Roman antiquities. You might know that on the quest of the origins of the European society in the 19th century. The English and the Germans were the best organized robbers in Asia Minor, and so they had some of the most significant collections, in other words, London and Berlin. And Berlin does have some breathtaking collections. By the way, if you look here to your left, straight across the square, just if you notice there's a modern building there, but an old entrance gate is attached to it. That's one of the old entrances to the Palace of Berlin. It's the only large facade piece that has been preserved. And as I said, we'll be coming back to this area. I'll tell you more about your surroundings then. For the time being, we're about to cross the Palace Bridge. As I said, to your left behind us is the Palace Square, here the Palace Bridge. That means actually for the second time today, and certainly not for the last time, we're crossing the River Spree, by the way, or Spree if you want, one of the main rivers in Berlin. And on the other side of the River Spree, the Grand Boulevard, the Royal Boulevard of Berlin begins, the Boulevard unter den Linden, which means under the linden trees. You're wondering about this here to your left? Yeah, but see, the point is that they're building that building behind that. Yeah, that's what it's going to look like, and that's what the building looked like that was here until the war. And it's what I call that Disneyland architecture, by the way, because it has absolutely no historical value. It's just a copy of the old versus restoration, which is something entirely different, where you use as much of the original, and more importantly, whatever you replace, what has been irretrievably damaged, you have to make it with the same tools and the same technology as the original. That's historical, that's restoration versus Disneyland architecture, and we have examples of both. But here to your right, this certainly is a restored building. This is the oldest still existing building on Unter den Linden. It's more than 300 years old, which for Berlin is pretty old, as I said. This is the old arsenal of Berlin, the old armory, which was built in 1695, and which normally would be the historical museum, the German Historical Museum. However, it's being restored. That's also a reoccurring theme here, because one thing that really is quite breathtakingly shocking, that is the truly criminal neglect of architecture in former East Germany. And so we've been struggling very hard, and still are, to undo the damage created just through neglect, and that's going to cost fortunes, can't even say a fortune, and still take a long time. So until next year, the building is closed. Then here to your left, this used to be the Crown Prince's Palace. It still goes by that name. Normally it would be a guest house of the government, but the German Historical Museum is using it at the moment since their building is closed. And this is also where Germany was reunified in 1990, where the representatives, in other words, of East and West Germany sat down at a table and signed the contract with the terms and conditions of the reunification. Never forget, this reunification was not automatic. There were two sovereign nations that agreed to this, and there obviously had to be terms and conditions for that. Then here to your left, this used to be the Princess's Palace. That's used commercially now. The building is now called the Opera Palace and has 4 restaurants and a cafe inside. And the last building of the Royal District, this is where the Royal District ended, is here to your right, the new Guard House. That's why there's a guard house here, since it was the beginning of the Royal District, just like the Tower District in London is the Royal District in London. And the new Guard House is now a central memorial of Germany, commemorating victims of war and dictatorship. Inside is a sculpture. You probably won't be lucky, but you can try to look inside. Usually there are people in the way, but there's a Pieta inside, a very modern Pieta, early 20th century, created by Käthe Kollwitz. She was an artist here in Germany in the 20s, 30s, and early 40s, and she had a very natural and healthy disgust towards any form of suppressive system, especially the one she witnessed in Germany in the 30s and 40s, and expressed that in her art, and was persecuted because of that, and that's why we chose one of her works. And that brings us to the most important part of Unter den Linden. And if you look straight ahead, in the center of the street, you can see the man responsible for these buildings, this ensemble. In front of us is King Frederick II, or Frederick the Great. And since you probably don't know when he was king, I'll tell you, he was king between 1740 and 1786. And by the way, it's really a tall order to try to get them all straight. They're all called Frederick or William or Frederick William. So for a one-day visit, I think that's asking a little much to get them straight, but he was really important, and you will learn more about him later when we go to Charlottenburg Palace. But for now, what's important is that he was responsible for this ensemble, the Linden Forum, or Forum Fredericianum, inspired by the Forum Romanum in Rome, and created, of course, in the 18th century. And the first building of the Linden Forum is here to your left behind us. That's the former Royal Opera House, now the German State Opera, inaugurated in 1743. And one of 3 opera houses in Berlin today, by the way, the oldest of the 3. Then across from the opera house to the left in front of us is the former Royal Library of Berlin, which now belongs to the Humboldt University. And the book burnings of National Socialism, in other words, the first fascist act under Hitler, began here at this building, or from this building, you could say, on May 10th of 1933. 20,000 books of all those not conformed to Nazi ideology were thrown through the windows of this building and burned in a huge bonfire. Books of philosophers, of scientists, of politicians, humanitarians, theologists, poets, playwrights, whatever. Now, this certainly wasn't the only time in the history of man that books were burned, and it also wasn't the only place where the Nazis burned books, but it was the first and largest and best organized of these events. In 1820, the German poet Heinrich Heine was a very scary prophet. He never knew that. He didn't live to understand how prophetic what he said was. But today, in retrospect, we see that. Heinrich Heine said in 1820, a nation that burns books eventually also will be capable of burning humans. And I think that really puts it to the point how much contempt towards the accumulated knowledge of man book burnings are. And that is why we have created a memorial here. You can't see it, but I would like to describe it because it really is interesting. It's underground, and there's an underground library. And this library has a capacity for 20,000 books, but there's not a single book inside since they've been burned. And that's really all there is to it. It's very unaggressive, and maybe you can understand that for the younger German generations, it's very important that people differentiate between being responsible and having responsibility. The younger generations were not alive when this happened. They are not responsible for what happened, but they do have the responsibility to acknowledge the history and to learn from it. And that is why it's underground, to signify that you stand above it. You're not a part of that history. And especially interesting when you consider the artist is from Israel. And I don't think it really matters that he's particularly from Israel, but that he's not German, that he's a foreigner for Germans, and that he nonetheless also understood that important difference. Misha Ullmann is the name, quite well known in Israel. Then here to your right, this is the main building of the Humboldt University, which was originally created as a palace for Prince Henry. He was the younger brother of Frederick the Great, so it was just a prince's palace. But in 1810, the German philologist Wilhelm von Humboldt founded this university here. He's the guy, behind the double-decker bus right now, to the left of the entrance. That's the philologist. Now, a lot of you, I'm sure, know the name Humboldt. You probably think, oh yeah, we have a Humboldt library or Humboldt whatnot. Then most likely you know this guy to the right of the entrance, Alexander von Humboldt. He was the natural scientist, the traveler in the family, the brother of Wilhelm von Humboldt. And he visited both American continents, especially South America. He explored the flora, the fauna there, the cultures there also. But he also did have a short visit to North America. I must admit, I don't know who was president when he was there, but I know he visited the president at the time. Then here to your left behind us, if you turn around in your seat a little, there's the last building of the Linden Forum. That's the St. Hedwig's Cathedral. And St. Hedwig's Cathedral was the first large Roman Catholic church in Protestant Berlin. And this is also, I find, an important theme also, even still to a certain extent today, that Berlin was reformed in the 16th century. So Berlin had been Protestant since then. And from then on, the royals opened their doors, both for religious refugees, in other words, Protestants that were being persecuted in Catholic Europe, and for other religions. That's a pretty big Catholic church. The symbol of Berlin is the bear, and so it's in the coat of arms of Berlin, and therefore in the flag of Berlin. It's like the lion in Munich, the bear in Berlin. And these bears are just like the cows in Chicago, if you're familiar with that art project, which actually came from Zurich, to be honest, from Switzerland. But the bears were painted by artists, were sponsored by companies, and will be auctioned for charity, of course, in the end. Then we've now entered the new part of Unter den Linden, where it gets a little bit more official. Now we're really coming into the area of the government, and that also means embassies. Here to your right, in the small side street, we have what is the U.S. Embassy at the moment. This was already the U.S. Embassy when this was still East Berlin and the capital of East Germany. It is not their future site. Now, 178 embassies either have moved, are in the process of moving, or must move in the future. One of the many consequences of the government's move to Berlin, the German government's move. And most nations, interestingly enough, can actually reclaim their historical properties. In other words, go back to where their embassies had been before World War II and build new embassies on old sites. And it is true also, that is also true of the United States. They also are building on their historical property. Unfortunately, however, immediately after the famous because, of course, of its Cold War symbolism in connection with the Berlin Wall. And there's a lot of confusion, not just from tourists from abroad, about what the setup was here. And one thing that a lot of people don't realize, if they've never been to Berlin, is that the Berlin Wall was not just one wall. That's important for you to understand to make any sense of this. The wall between West and East Berlin was two walls, you see. And if you think about it, really it makes a lot of sense. How in heavens would anybody guard an urban border if it only consisted of one wall? So East Germany built a second one to, in effect, completely isolate a certain strip of land where they could have their guards, their watchtowers, their lights, their shooting devices, and so on and so forth. So this was a part of that borderline. The inner wall is already behind us. We've already come into restricted area of Berlin. We're still divided. By the way, here to your left, the empty corner plot, that's the exterritorial property of the U.S., just on the side. And the Brandenburg Gate itself, in other words, was between the two walls. Paris Square, the square we're on, and the Brandenburg Gate, isolated between two walls. It was on East German territory, East Berlin territory, but nobody could get to it because on either side of the gate there was a boundary, a barrier, a border in that sense. And if you think about the fact that this was a city gate originally, what's a city gate if not a symbol of passage? And it was unavailable from either side. The perversion of that situation, that is what inspired people to think of this as a symbol of the division of Berlin more than any other part of the borderline, you see. And that is why when the wall fell, the Berliners didn't plan to go to the Brandenburg Gate. It was so logical to come here to celebrate the disappearance of this same border at this gate, and that is why it has now become a symbol of the reunification of Germany. And unfortunately, because it is so important as a symbol, undoubtedly the most important symbol in Berlin, it has been neglected a little bit. You see, every time specialists said we have to restore the gate, they said, but we've got the unification celebration coming up, the marathon, the love parade, and whatnot. And so can't you just do the basics and not so long so that we can take the scaffolding down before the celebration starts? And now we're paying the price. It's going to be covered for about 2 years. This is because of restoration going on, and that is why you can only see assimilation. And you can actually count yourself lucky. It's the best assimilation we have. Unfortunately, the Telekom has donated about 15 million towards restoration. Berlin is completely broke at the moment, by the way, and that's why we need to take advantage of such generous offers, and that's why they're allowed to decorate the scaffolding, and they've had some really ridiculous pictures on there. They've shoved all the columns together to form a T, Telecom. They've twisted them around each other in the simulation, entwined for the love parade, and this is at least realistic. We've had the hardest time explaining to tourists that no, we have not sawed off the columns to allow traffic through. They'd get so confused when they'd see the picture, but this is real, and I think it's quite charming. Did you notice as we approached it, you saw the Eiffel Tower and the Arc of Triumph, which of course I think you know belonged to Paris, and from the opposite side is the Kremlin, Moscow, because if you look at Europe, Paris, Moscow, Berlin is halfway between the two, and it's always been a very important connection throughout Europe. And of course, it's again Telecom, connecting worlds. By the way, just briefly, the gate was originally built a little over 200 years ago, again as a city gate. It's the only still remaining city gate that we have in Berlin today. It was built inspired by the Propylaeas. If you've been on the Acropolis in Athens, that's where the Propylaeas are. And on top of the gate, you probably noticed the quadriga. That was a four-horse-drawn carriage with the Greek goddess of victory, unfortunately better known for her sports line and tennis shoes. That's Nike up there. And again, as I said, when Berlin was divided, the wall divided or surrounded, the two walls surrounded the gate. We have marked the outer wall. The outer wall was the actual political border, where the border was between the West Berlin and the East Berlin. The inner wall was placed wherever possible. That didn't follow any precise guidelines in that sense. And here in front of us you can see a double row of cobblestone in the road. That is the course of the wall. So basically most of us are still in what was East Berlin, but in that restricted area.
Yes, see, when it was all destroyed, see, during the war.
What is it called?
It's called the Brandenburg Gate.
Why is it so special?
Oh, because, you know, it was very special in the old days.
Yes, the unity of Germany was only in 1871, and because Prussia controlled this political step, it was logical that the King of Prussia would become the Emperor of the German Empire, and that was William I. And it was obvious that therefore his residence, Berlin, would be the new capital, even though geographically, economically, that didn't make a lot of sense, but it did politically. And that is why it was necessary to create a parliament building in Berlin. And that was this. Reichstag means Imperial Parliament building, basically, our Imperial Parliament. And the Reichstag was inaugurated in 1894, and it served as the Imperial Parliament, as the seat of the German Parliament until 1933. And that means that it saw the political changes that occurred. The first change, of course, is in 1918. World War I is over. The November Revolution takes place in Germany, at the end of which the emperor is forced to abdicate, and the proclamation of the first German Republic. The first German Republic is proclaimed from this building, beginning the first democracy in Germany, the first attempt at democracy anyway. And this democracy lasts until 1933. And in 1932 there are Reichstag elections, and the NSDAP, the Nazi Party, wins this election. And Hitler was their appointed candidate, and so it was a normal democratic procedure that the former Chancellor Hindenburg handed over his office to Adolf Hitler in January of 1933. And of course from then on Hitler starts to try to undermine this democracy, since that's not his goal, and he's not very successful in that. But on the 27th of February of 1933 the Reichstag building burns down. Picture that. Imagine that the state capital, or the capital of the United States, burns down, and you know that somebody burned it down for political reasons. Hitler is quick to produce a scapegoat. Dutch citizen Marinus van der Lubbe is the alleged arsonist, is sentenced to death for this fire, and because of the shock of the parliament and of the population in general, that anybody would even be able to burn down a building that stood for democracy, they gave him what he wanted, and that was the Enabling Act. And the Enabling Act gave the Chancellor the power to monitor and control the existence of political parties in case there was one that would work against the foundations of democracy. Well, what did he do with this power? He turned around, claimed them all dangerous to the democracy, got rid of them all, and began his dictatorship. So in short terms, the burning of the Reichstag began the dictatorship in Germany. And that's why it's also so ironic that the end of this dictatorship is also marked by the burning of the Reichstag. This building was never used by Hitler except for in the first few days when he was Chancellor, but still under a democracy. It's often confused by many with the Reichschancellery. That's a dangerous thing to do. The Chancellery was Hitler's center of power. And in 1945, the Red Army marched right by the Chancellery. They had no interest in that building and went straight to this building. For them to take this building meant a victory over Berlin, and the destruction of this building is more symbolic of the defeat of Germany in 1945 than the destruction of anything else. 6,000 soldiers on German and Soviet side died fighting for this building in the last days of World War II, to give you an understanding of how important it was to them symbolically, what it meant. And when the Soviets took the building, the Germans surrendered. The Berliners initially, of course, and then the Germans surrendered immediately. In the 1960s, West Berlin decided to rebuild this building, and again, it's interesting to see why. Berlin was divided. The wall had been built. It was quite obvious that this division was going to stick around. The government of West Germany was in Bonn. There was no reason to build a parliament building in West Berlin, and yet they did nonetheless. Why? Because West Berlin was in the middle of East Germany, you see, and the Reichstag was right at the wall. It was visible from East Berlin. And what did it stand for? It stood for the German quest for parliamentarian democracy. It was a symbol of democracy in the middle of East Germany, you see. That's why they rebuilt it. And then, of course, when the wall fell in 1989, the world turned upside down, and suddenly new potential was opened to us. And a year later, the German reunification was celebrated inside this building on October 3rd of 1990. And a year after that, we had the first full German parliament meeting inside this building since 1933. And that was to determine whether the government would move back to Berlin or not. I would say that's a lot of history for one building in a little over 100 years, especially. And that is why Sir Norman Foster won the competition in redesigning this building, because he respected, like no one else, in his design for this building, the need, the absolute necessity to acknowledge two buildings here, because it's absolutely necessary that we preserve enough of the Reichstag to be reminded of its history, but at the same time it would be unacceptable to expect of the German parliament today to work in a museum. A government can't work in a museum. So we need two buildings. And his solution was so simple and therefore so effective, so amazingly effective. The only thing he did is he gutted the building. You just have to get the idea. That's the trick. That's the art. He gutted it. He carved it like a pumpkin. He took everything out from basement to ceiling and only left the historical shell. And into this historical shell, he built a new Bundestag building. The Bundestag is the federal parliament today. So it's actually two buildings in one. On the outside, the Reichstag, on the inside, the Bundestag. And then he added the dome, based upon the simple principle that the sovereign of a democracy are the people, and that the people therefore should have access to their representation, and that there, in fact, he has shown us the hierarchy that the government always tends to forget, you know. The people are on the top, enjoying the view or enjoying themselves in the restaurant up there, while their elected servants are working beneath them. You see, it's quite clear if you look at it that way. And it's all glass inside. The government doesn't want to hide behind walls anymore. They want people to be able to see what is going on in the government. See, these are the symbolisms of the building. It cost us 600 million German marks to do that, by the way, the redecorations. And it was completed in April of '99. That's when the government officially moved to Berlin. So now this is the seat of the Bundestag. The official PC term, by the way, is New Plenary Hall of the German Bundestag inside the old Reichstag building. They discussed that for 3 weeks before they came up with that term. North of the Reichstag, we then have the Parliament offices. That is one of 3 complexes being built for the Parliament. We've got 660 members in the German Bundestag. We're working towards reducing to 650. The government determined they need at least 2 offices per parliamentarian, so to be safe, they'll build 3. And they have, and it's still not enough. And that is connected to the building to your right in front of us, and that's the reason for the roadblocks right now, because it's open house in the government today. Everybody can visit, and that's the Chancellery, that big building to the right in front of us. And Gerhard Schröder at the moment, he's the political leader of this country, and he doesn't like the building, and I would call that an attribute, because the reason he doesn't like it, the money is coming straight out of all our social services. I don't know if you know that Germany was modeled pretty much after Sweden after World War II, out of West Germany, at least the principle of lots of strong social services and such, and we're going completely broke now, and therefore where are they taking the money from? From there, needless to say. Okay, we had another roadblock that I didn't anticipate, and I'm a little bit upset about that. So we're missing the presidential palace, but there's really nothing I can do about that. I was hoping that that road would be open. But what you're not missing is the Tiergarten, even though we have nicer perspectives of it. Nonetheless, you can see it's a pretty big park. The name, literally translated, means animal garden, and that's really basically what this was. This was the hunting grounds outside of Berlin. I wasn't quick enough to mention it, but just behind us is the Brandenburg Gate again. That's the road that you saw once before when we came through the Brandenburg Gate. And so we are, in fact, just outside of the old city limits where the royals used to hunt. And the Tiergarten was then turned into a public park in the 18th century, redesigned in the 19th century, and today it has a size of approximately 750 acres. And just by chance, I stumbled across the dimensions of Central Park, and I must admit I was surprised, but it's true. This is only marginally smaller than Central Park in New York City. And it's always been an important park for the Berliners, a very, very important green lung, as you can imagine. These are things that you could assume on your own just by seeing this and knowing what it's like to live in a big city. But one thing that you can't really see, but which is also true, it was a lot more vital than that. It provided a lot of firewood for the Berliners during the blockade after World War II, and it also, none of these trees are older than 50, in other words. 2 million people were freezing in this city. 750 acres doesn't go far away when you have those circumstances, but also they were starving. And so what did they do? They got the elephants out of the zoo because they'd eaten all the cows and the horses, and they put them in front of plows and started gardening here. They grew vegetables of any kind, anything that would grow here. They grew to in any way survive the post-World War II years, and particularly the months of the blockade. So again, the replanting was done, by the way, through donations made by Great Britain and the Federal Republic of Germany, West Germany in other words. Why Great Britain? Because this was the British sector. We also have areas where the same story can be told in what was the American sector, where actually the U.S., at least financially, also supported the replanting. I doubt they sent trees across the ocean, but I know that they financially helped recreate the forests. Okay, roadblocks means traffic on other streets, so we've got a little bit of time, by the way, but of course, as usual, there weren't enough protests. But we certainly have enough roadblocks here today. There's our next one here to your right. Somehow, I don't know, I guess people get a little bit crazy at the end of August. They know that the long, gloomy winter is coming up, and so they try to spend as much time outside as remotely possible. Yeah, still the same Tiergarten. Really, I mean, you're on a main road, so the Tiergarten, to protect itself, I mean, there's dense foliage here, but if you went inside, there's some beautiful garden architecture, garden structures. There's an English garden. There are sculptures all over. There are little artificial lakes and streams. It really is a beautiful place, especially in the summertime. And considering how big Berlin is, I mean, Berlin is 8 times larger than Paris. Nobody has the time, even on the weekend, even now that the wall is gone and you can hop in your car and go out into the outskirts outside of Berlin for recreation. Who's going to bother? They've got everything they need right here, and that way they don't have to travel so far. And generally, the Tiergarten is certainly the largest of its kind in Berlin, but it is not, by far not the only one. We've got big public parks scattered throughout the entire city, little oases, you know, where you wouldn't even expect them. You're going down this big wide road, and you turn the corner twice, and suddenly you've got a little lake, a little park around it, and everything is peaceful and quiet in the middle of the city. And that really is, I would say, the big secret of success here in Berlin, that the city is so filled with nature and water. We've got 40 lakes, 20 canals, the 2 main rivers, Havel and Spree, some smaller rivers, and so on and so forth. Anyway, we've got so much nature and water in Berlin, that 1/3 of the area of Berlin is green or blue, whichever way you put it, and that is a world record, and that guarantees a certain standard in the quality of living in Berlin. Then up ahead, the Charlottenburg Gate, and this used to be the gate to the independent city Charlottenburg, and on this gate are the statues of the first royal couple of Prussia. To your left is King Frederick I, and to your right, his wife, Queen Sophie Charlotte. The similarity between Charlottenburg and the name of this queen is, by the way, no coincidence. Charlottenburg was named after her, and since, unless you really, really studied this in great detail, I can't expect you to know these guys, but you might know at least a little bit about the English royal history. She was the sister of King George I of Great Britain. I mean, there were all related anyway, but this is a pretty important connection because her brother was the first German on the throne of Great Britain, something that the English royal family doesn't really like to acknowledge since National Socialism, or actually since World War I, is that they're actually all German. Oh no, that's a flea market. I don't know about good shopping. That's a good place to rip you off. No, you don't worry about shopping. You'll get good shopping, believe me. But again, we don't actually have official shopping time. It's just a matter of making yourself some time for shopping. Now, by the way, the buildings that you see here to your left and right of the street belong to the Technical University, and the Technical University is the second oldest university of Berlin after the Humboldt University. We generally have 3 universities in the city. The Free University is the youngest, and we have 19 academies, and altogether we have approximately 140,000 students. And like in most European cities, Berlin can drop some pretty heavy names when it comes to the history, especially here at the Technical University. We can talk about Albert Einstein or Max Planck or Otto Hahn. I mean, especially in the sciences, there were quite a few Germans that were quite big, important pioneers, especially in the late 19th and early 20th century. And here at this roundabout, by the way, we are going to learn the flags here in Berlin here, since we had some confusion at the Brandenburg Gate. The blue flag with the yellow stars on it is the flag of Europe. Those are the nations that are a part of the European community. The black, red, and gold flag is the flag of Germany, and the red and white flag is the flag of Berlin, the bear, the symbol of Berlin, as I had mentioned before. The other ones, by the way, are an advertisement for the horticultural fair in Potsdam, so that's not so important. They're not political flags. But the flag of Berlin, you'll see that again and again on official buildings, of course, as well as the German flag. See, now we're heading into downtown West Berlin, and keep in mind the difference, the very remarkable difference between West and East Berlin were the politics, and that also meant economy. There was no free market system in the East, but there certainly was in the West, and okay, you had to deal with transit and going through East Germany to get to West Berlin, but that didn't mean that they were completely cut off from the civilized world, and certainly West Berlin developed like other cities did as well in a commercial sense. And our downtown area is a downtown area like any other German downtown area, if not even maybe a little bit bigger than most other ones. First of all, however, here to your left, you can see the Academy of Arts, the main building of the Academy of Arts. And directly in front of us, we've got our train station, Zoological Gardens. Now, that's an unusual name for a big railroad station in the middle of a big city. But then again, that is really the proof of the simple fact that even though this is downtown West Berlin today, and has certainly had the last 50 years to establish itself as such, it is not historically or geographically in any way logical as a center, and it was never intended as a center. And that you can see through the simple fact that our train station is certainly not just named at whim, but rather it was named after the fact that it's next to the zoo. And the zoo was not planned in a center, believe me. When it was established 160 years ago, it was established west of Berlin. And this whole area is only roughly 120 years old and was created as the West End of Berlin, an exclusive residential area to a certain extent, and yet nonetheless, by the way, an urban area, residential but with urban structures. The idea came from Bismarck, and he didn't think of this on his own. He got the idea from Paris. The Champs-Élysées in Paris inspired the Grand Boulevard here in this part of Berlin, the Kurfürstendamm. And because this was urban, and because if you only looked at West Berlin, it was still fairly central. It was predestined to be turned into a city center for West Berlin after Berlin had been divided. They needed their own center. They might as well create it here. So here to your left, once again, the train station zoo, but also the zoo just down the road here to the left. And in front of us, you can also see a very famous landmark of Berlin, the Emperor William Memorial Churches. And the old church was built in 1895, commemorative of Emperor William I. It was then heavily damaged during World War II, and the ruin was left standing as a warning against war and destruction. And in 1961, the new church was added. You see how on either side of the ruin are modern structures, pretty drab and gray right now, but those modern structures are made of 22,000 leaded glass windows, and this is blue glass, and so when you go inside, the daylight filters through. It's really quite beautiful, or at night you get the same effect because it's illuminated from the inside out. The church inside the ruin, there also is a small exhibition showing the history of the church, and I'm telling you this also in such detail because we're going to pass the Kempinski in a moment. And that's where we're having lunch, and lunch is arranged for an hour and a half, more or less, giving you this hidden little opportunity to shop if you must, without actually giving you official shopping time. So it's entirely up to you how much time you spend eating and how much time you spend shopping. And as we have now reached the Kurfürstendamm, the Kudamm, and the Kudamm is the longest shopping and amusement street of Berlin. Basically, the Berliners claim there's nothing you can't buy here, or put it differently, if you can't buy it here, then you can't buy it in Berlin. Whether legal or illegal, doesn't matter. It depends on which direction you go, how expensive you're going to get. Here you can see some of the names that you might recognize as affordable names, big brands, but the further down you go, the more expensive it gets. I mean, if you insist on buying Louis Vuitton or something like that, you'll also find it if you look for it. Okay, but first, history again. The Story of Berlin is an exhibition that is really a very unusual way to explore the history. And by the way, here to your right is the street where the hotel is. The Kempinski is just in the small side street here. That's where we're scheduled for lunch. And what I'm going to do, because the exhibition is just a block and a half down and they're short blocks, it would be stupid. It would take more time to get back on the bus and go all the way around since this is a one-way street. Oh, wait a minute. Yeah. Then I'll have to give you the time for meeting again as well. Oh, yeah, okay, we'll figure that out. But first, let me explain the exhibition, since it'll be a moment till we're there. The exhibition is, as I said, a very modern way of approaching history, and it covers 800 years of history, more or less. And it is like a time tunnel taking you through, because there's no way you could cover 800 years of history in less than an hour, in about 45 minutes, unless you go through a time tunnel. You won't cover every incident and every issue that ever came up, but it's arranged using all forms of media. You've got visual as well as audio impressions also, and it's very, very difficult to guide through such an exhibition, especially because the rooms are rather narrow. And it's sometimes just very hard to gather you all. And I think also, especially with this group, that you all are pretty independent, and the exhibition does to a certain extent also explain itself, in as far as that everything that's there in writing is also there in writing in English as well as in German. And I nonetheless will be there, and I will guide those who want to be guided, but I want you to also know that you're absolutely free to move inside the exhibition on your own. If you're faster or slower, that's up to you. You can do that. It's a one-way course through the exhibition, ladies and gentlemen. That means you can't go back. And there's one symbolism that I do want to explain so that all of you understand it, and that is we're starting 800 years ago when Berlin was founded, and we have to go up to start the exhibition, and from there on we'll always be ascending to the 20s, and when the 20s are over, we have to go down more flights than we went up. And then we stay way down there in the pits until 1989. And then to exit the exhibition, you take an elevator up. I think the symbolism is quite clear. It's very much conform with how the course of history went. Going up, a rise, a positive development. Going down, obviously a drop, a negative development. And that's something that I didn't really notice until the second or third time through, and that's why I'm mentioning this. And at the end, it's in this little mall, so you have to follow the red feet here.